Good evening. My name is Malini Roy, and I'm the head of visual arts here at the British Library. Thank you for joining us this evening to learn about the British Library's collection of art. I wanted to start the evening by first thanking Art UK for inviting me to speak, but also for their continued support to national collections through their innovative platform. The British Library is the National Library of the United Kingdom. It came into existence in 1973 as a result of the British Library Act. Parliament's vision was for a single institution at the heart of UK's information network, which would aid scientific and technological research, business, the arts, and humanities. This year, we celebrate the British Library's 50th birthday or anniversary. You may be wondering why the British Library is featured on Art UK. The library holds a modest collection of fine art and sculpture, of which 376 works are featured on the platform. The library, in fact, holds approximately 35,000 works on paper, watercolors, drawings, and prints. These can be consulted in our print room or reading rooms by registered readers. The British Library is situated in central London, located between Euston and St. Pancras stations. In 1964, the architect Colin St. John Wilson and his partner M.J. Long, with their teams, were appointed to design the library. Wilson's architectural vision was influenced by a combination of British modernist and Scandinavian design. Over a 30-year period, Wilson was heavily vested in the design and construction of the building. With a range of delays, including funding cuts, the design was formally approved in 1978. The building itself was not completed till 1997 and formally opened in 1998. Colin St. John Wilson, affectionately known as Sandy, was not only invested in the architectural design of the building, but also the interior design and selection of artwork. Wilson and the Works of Art Committee selected and commissioned major artworks that are integral to the design of the building. Entering the British Library from Euston Road, the main gate is the work of David Kindersley, a stone letter carver and typeface designer, and his wife, Lida Cardozo Kindersley. The gates feature the repetition of the library's name. Looking at the gate, the space between the letters are gradually reduced. This was a concession that Kindersley and Cardozo had to make for health and safety laws, and really to prevent young visitors from trapping their arms or legs in the narrow gaps. Beyond the gateway is the library's most prominent work of art, Edoardo Palazzi's sculpture of Newton after Blake. This 12-foot high and 6-ton sculpture was integral to the architect's vision for the library. Palazzi was directly influenced by the artist William Blake's 1795 watercolor of Sir Isaac Newton, where the scientist was portrayed as a classical nude, seated with his body hunched down and drawing with his compass on a paper laying on the floor. In Palazzi's reimagining, the classically idealized body, with a head of Michelangelo's David, is brought into the machine age, bisected with nuts, bolts, and screws. The sculpture sees not a straightforward criticism of Newton, science and rationality, but a, quote, fusion of nature, science, poetry, and art and architecture, linked by the classically beautiful body of Newton crouched in a position which brings to mind Rodin's thinker, end quote. As a balanced representation of the humanities and sciences, the sculpture was deemed the perfect symbol for the National Library by the Works of Art Committee. It was cast by the Morris Singer Foundry in bronze in numerous sections. In the 1990s, as part of the commissioning process, the chairman of the British Library arranged for the sculptor Celia Scott to make this bust portrait of Sandy Wilson. Scott made two different versions of the bust portrait, with and without the scarf. The curator and chairman chose the present version because they felt it was much more characteristic of the sitter. The final placement of the bust in the front entrance hall was a subject of exhaustive discussion between the architect, artist, curator, and other British Library staff to ensure it would not cause an obstruction under head height. In fact, Sandy Wilson's bust portrait carefully watches readers and visitors as they enter the library's main entrance. In recent years, the library, through the support of the American Trust for the British Library, commissioned a bust portrait of Sandy Wilson's partner, M.J. Long. Long was not only part of the team working on the design of the original building, but was central to the design of the conservation studio that was finished in 2005. Sculptor Celia Scott created the M.J. Long bust portrait in bronze, which was only unveiled last year. Visitors to the library will find M.J. Long on the upper ground floor. As a trained architect, Carl Loben's almost hyper-real painting of the interior of the British Library was based on architectural drawings produced by Colin St. John Wilson and his team. Photographic in its detail, Loben illustrated the King's Library Tower with a cafe on the left. As an homage to the architect, Loben featured Wilson in the foreground, accompanied by a reader holding a stack of leather-bound books. Put the pointer just down here. In the cafe, a number of historical authors, including Dostoevsky and T.S. Eliot, are featured. There's another version of Loben's painting, which is held in the Reba collections, which features Wilson and his partner, M.J. Long, standing behind the plants and hidden in the cafe. One of the most prominent features of the building, the King's Tower Library, is situated on the left, or on the right. The glass tower holds the collections of King George III. At the time of his death, his library was considered to be one of the largest libraries in Europe, consisting of 78,000 items, including maps and topographical views. George IV stipulated that his father's collection should be displayed, and I quote, entire and separate from the rest of the library, in a repository to be appropriated exclusively for that purpose, end quote. Wilson's design of the tower allows visitors to see the library through the glass windows on all four sides. In this creative illustration, Loben also included the sculpture bust of King George III on a plinth immediately in front of the tower. This is an artwork that Wilson had shortlisted for the building and would ultimately be situated on a different side of the tower. The sculpture in this photograph, you can see, is actually situated in the front of the tower when you come up the staircase. This bust was made by the artist Peter Tornarelli and dates to 1812. Peter Tornarelli was trained at the Royal Academy and later under the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova in Rome. Tornarelli was recognized as the teacher and sculptor to Queen Charlotte and her daughter. A few years later, in recognition of his work, he was appointed as the sculptor in ordinary to the royal family. Over the course of his career, he produced many royal portraits of George III and members of his family. Our bust, which features King George III with the beautiful laurel wreath on his head, is based on the historical tradition of presenting rulers as a Roman emperor to symbolically convey power and authority. There are 4 copies of this version. The others are held in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Newark Town Hall in America, and Trinity College, Dublin. This one is thought to be the prime, as it is the only one which is signed and dated. Following on the theme of foundation collections, on display at the library is a portrait of King George III that's attributed to Sir William Beechey. Beechey, who dates from 1753 to 1839, was a leading portraitist of the golden age of British painting. He studied under Johann Zoffany at the Royal Academy Schools and developed a restrained style which suited the conventional taste of George III and Queen Charlotte. So by 1793, he was officially named portrait painter to Queen Charlotte and received many more royal commissions. His 1798 painting of George III and the Prince of Wales reviewing the troops so delighted the king that Beechey was knighted. This was the only painting to be destroyed in the 1992 Windsor Castle fire, but a smaller version exists in the National Army Museum. This also spawned several reduced studio versions, just showing the figures of George III and his horse, which includes the British Library's copy. Colin St. John Wilson was very keen to include and display many key collections that were to be held at the British Library. The Royal Music Library, formerly housed in the British Museum, was brought to St. Pancras, the world's famous collection of printed and manuscript music. Amongst the collections are a small number of sculptures and portraits of notable composers. One such artwork is that of the German composer Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach, who dates from 1685 to 1750, was a leading composer of the late Baroque period. A revival of his work in the 19th century cemented his reputation as one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music, and likely prompted this copy of his portrait. This 19th century copy, which probably dates to 1830, of a 1748 original portrait of the composer, is by Elias Gottlob Hausmann. The original is thought to be the best contemporary likeness of Bach and is in the Museum of City History in Leipzig. It is Hausmann's best-known work and shows the composer holding a sheet music for his Riddle Canon, a complex composition for 6 voices that loops back on itself. The core of the library's art collection, however, is much more international. And it's these highlights that I'm going to show in the next few slides, which are mainly featured on Art UK. While the British Library was incorporated as an Act of Parliament in 1973, the institution known as the India Office Library was absorbed into the British Library in 1982. The India Office Library was originally established as the East India Company's library, with headquarters on Leadenhall Street in the City of London. Alongside the library's records and archives, the collections of prints, drawings, and photographs were incorporated into the British Library. This collection includes oil paintings, sculptures, prints, drawings, photographs, as well as furniture, coins, medals, and weapons. In learning about the history of the building and the preparations made by the Works of Art Committee, the notes regarding the Asian and African Reading Room, where the India Office library collections can be consulted, the communications between the architect, curator, and conservation team are often consulted by curators to understand the displays and rationale behind the decisions made in this period. When Colin St. John Wilson designed the dedicated reading room on the 3rd floor of the British Library for the India Office collections and the long-term storage plans on site, he was informed by the curators that the designated space on the walls were not the correct height to accommodate the artworks that he had selected. For this, Wilson went back to the drawings to adjust the height of the room. He also later had to amend the windows on the opposite wall and their designs to include a set of blinds that could be shut in order for the natural light to be minimized and not directly impact the artworks on display. At the far end of the room, or really close to the entrance to the reading room, is this portrait of Lord Clive receiving from the Nawab of Bengal the grant of the sum of money for Lord Clive's fund by Edward Penny. The portraits and artworks on display in the reading room reflects the broad scope of its collections. The majority of the artworks, however, are historically connected with British colonial rule in Asia. This included historical scenes and portraits of both Western sitters and local rulers in South Asia and the Middle East. In the late 18th century, it was not uncommon for the East India Company to commission London-based artists to create a range of historical paintings, portraits, and sculptures to bolster its reputation at home. The new works were strategically placed in the company's headquarters on Leadenhall Street in London. One of these paintings on display in the reading room features Robert Clive, who's often nicknamed Clive of India, as he amassed his fortune while employed for the East India Company. In 1772, at the time when British Parliament was investigating Clive and his newly amassed wealth, the company commissioned the painter Edward Penny of the Royal Academy to illustrate Clive in a manner to improve his reputation. In this scene, Clive is featured as a benefactor who set up a charity, the Lord Clive Fund, to assist disabled soldiers and widows of officers who took funds from the then subservient provincial governor of Bengal, whose name was Nawab Najib al-Dawla. With artists such as Edward Penny and Benjamin West painting on subjects relating to India while sitting in England, a number of Royal Academy trained artists made their way to the Indian subcontinent. Requiring permission from the East India Company to travel inland to cities such as Lucknow, located in the northern province of Oudh, artists including John Smart, Esaias Humphrey, and Johann Zoffany arrived in the region during the 1770s and 80s. On arrival in the bustling metropolis, they received commissions from both British officers as well as local Indian noblemen. The provincial governor of Oudh, Asafudallah, commissioned Zoffany to paint portraits of himself as well as his chief minister, Hassan Reza Khan. In this work, the governor is featured in a floor-length white muslin garment and adorned with necklaces and armlets of pearls and precious gems. He wears the distinctive Lucknow style of turban with a crescent band. This portrait convention and physiognomy would be replicated not only by Zoffany's contemporaries, such as Esaias Humphrey in India, but also Indian artists in the region. In fact, I just saw Esaias Humphrey's portrait in miniature painted on ivory in the National Portrait Gallery's reinstallation. According to a contemporary inscription on the back of this painting, the governor presented the painting as a gift to the British surgeon Francis Thomas, who was stationed at the Lucknow Residency in 1784. The ornate frame surrounding this oversized painting is adorned with the symbol of the province of Oudh, including a trophy of swords, a flag, and a fish. In terms of oil paintings, the library's collection is representative of local South Asian artists who adopted new Western techniques and mediums, such as watercolor and ivory and oil on board or canvas to paint portrait studies, genre scenes, or topographical views. One of these artists is a Delhi-based artist named Jeevan Ram, who was exceptionally talented and used a range of techniques from watercolor on paper to oil on canvas. He was clearly influenced by the work of British artist George Chinnery and had seen samples of his work in India. Jeevan Ram painted portraits of the Mughal Emperor Akbar II in 1834 using watercolors. One of the first curators of prints and drawings at the India Office Library, named Mildred Archer, located examples of signed works by Jeevan Ram of portraits of British officials in the region, and purchased from local auctions and added them to the collections in the 1970s and 1980s. According to the art historian J.P. Losty, Jeevan Ram had no competition from British artists in the same region of Upper India at this time, and would later work directly for the famous Begum Samru of Sardana, whose palace was decorated with some 20 of his oil paintings. Moving away from oil paintings and two-dimensional works, I really wanted to share something that sheds light a bit more on the library's collection. In the mid-19th century, we find Indian artists and craftsmen in the eastern Indian region of Bengal starting to use terracotta and clay as a medium for sculpting and modeling images of tradesmen and occupations, rather than simply using this medium for producing religious divinities. These were created for both the local and export markets. These small sculptures complemented the watercolor drawings that were increasingly mass-produced for the export market and often brought back to England and Europe in the 19th century. The library's collection includes several works by Jadunath Pal, who is one of the finest clay sculptors and whose work was first brought to the West for the Great Exhibition of 1851, both as sets of occupations as well as scenes such as indigo farms, the judge's court, and the like, and most were shown at 19th century trade exhibitions. Here, the figure is dressed in miniature cloth garments and have real hair attached. This example is missing some pieces, but it shows a seated tailor with his left leg tucked under, with both hands in front holding a now missing objects, such as a needle and a cloth. The library's collection has extensive holdings on topographical views and genre scenes across a number of media relating to South Asia, both by regional artists, but also by European amateur and professional artists. This includes works by the British artists such as Thomas and William Daniels, William Hodges, and Arthur Davis, but also South Asian artists including Mazhar Ali Khan, Malini Roy, and Rabindranath Tagore. One of the more delicate and smaller paintings in the collection is this rather beautiful painting of Mumbai's harbor. The Russian artist Horace van Ruth regularly exhibited his portraits, genre scenes, and landscapes in Germany, Austria, and Italy before setting up a studio in Western India. Between 1879 and 1884, van Ruth showed his works at exhibitions through the Pune Fine Arts Society and at societies in Mumbai. As an accomplished artist working in both watercolors and oils, this rather small, striking genre scene features the iridescent skyline and the shore of Bombay in the far distance, with Parsis or Zoroastrians praying in the foreground or on the beaches. The library's core collection of oil paintings and sculptures are featured on Art UK. However, the wider collections of prints and drawings, as well as historic photographs, are partially digitized and available through the British Library's Archives and Manuscripts online catalog. These core collections continue to provide vital information for researchers who work on architectural and archaeological history, anthropology, and the history of art. Thank you for joining us this evening to learn about the library's art collection.